I would like to give you my outlook for the US and the global economy and the implication for financial markets. If I think about the questions that are on everybody's mind, whether you are a business person in the financial sector, policymaker, and so on, I think there are at least 5 or 6 questions that are on everybody's mind. I'll try to give you at least some flavor of my views on it. I'll speak for a while, and then I'll open it also to a Q&A, because I'd like to be able to have a dialogue and answer a specific question you might have as well. The question that everybody's asking are, of course, the first one is about this global financial crisis. Leaving aside for the time being the question of what were the causes of it, I think that the most compelling issue right now is rather, is the worst behind us, is the worst ahead of us, which kind of policy changes are going to get us out of this financial crisis, what's the state of financial institutions and banks in the US and Europe and other parts of the world, how severe are their problems. So that's one set of questions. The second set of questions has to do with the US economy and how bad this US economic recession is going to be. And certainly this question is important because US being the largest economy in the world, still about 30% of global GDP. People say when the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches the cold. And in this case, the US is not just sneezing, has had a severe case of chronic pneumonia, and therefore, as we've seen, the contagion, both financial and now real, to the rest of the world has been severe. There has not been decoupling, there has been recoupling of the global economy. That leads me to the third question: what's happening in the rest of the world? What's happening in advanced economies like Europe, Japan, and other advanced economies, and what's happening in emerging market economies? Emerging market economies in Asia, India, China, other ones, in emerging Europe, in Latin America, in Africa. How much of a slowdown or contraction is going to occur around the world? The fourth question that people think about is whether we should be worrying about deflationary forces in the global economy or inflationary forces, and over which time horizon we should worry about deflation versus inflation. The fifth question is the question about the policy response. Which kind of policies are going to get us out of this mess, this financial and economic crisis? Which monetary and fiscal policies, which orthodox and unorthodox monetary and fiscal policies? And monetary policies are becoming very unorthodox in many dimensions. And which sets of other policies? Policies to clean up the financial system, policies to deal with the debt problems of households and firms, policies to reduce this sudden stop of capital that's now hitting emerging market economy, how much money should be given to the IMF to provide liquidity support to emerging markets now being squeezed, and which other policies are going to get us out of this financial mess. And finally, for those that are more in financial market, of course, the final question is, given this kind of economic and financial outlook, what are the implications for all the major asset classes, US and global equities, government bond yields, credit spreads for corporates, housing and housing-related assets, the value of major currencies, commodity prices, and all the emerging market asset classes, bonds, stocks, and currencies in emerging markets. So there is plenty one could touch, and given the time limit, I'm going to concentrate only on some of these questions, mostly the first 3, and I'm sure that some of the other ones are going to also come up in the Q&A. Let me start with the question of how bad things are in the financial system. Here there are some good news and some bad news. The good news is that after the near global financial meltdown that we had the last fall, after the collapse of Lehman, literally, we were 1 epsilon away from a total financial meltdown. There was like a cardiac arrest of the global financial system. We recovered because the G7 essentially made a few commitments at the time of the IMF meetings. They said, we're not going to let any systemically important financial institution fail in a disorderly way, i.e., we made a mistake by letting Lehman Brothers go in a disorderly way. We're going to provide unlimited liquidity to the financial system. We're going to guarantee more and more deposits. We're going to also guarantee new borrowings and debts by banks. We're going to provide capital and recapitalize financial institutions that are undercapitalized. And we're going to do everything else to avoid the systemic financial meltdown. So, for example, now money market spreads have been kind of narrowed high-grade corporates have access now to the bond market after that bond market was closed for a few months. So things have slightly improved in that direction. There's not going to be maybe a total systemic financial meltdown. But the bad news is that actually the problems of the financial system and financial institutions are not getting better. They're getting worse in many dimensions. You know, about a year ago, I wrote a piece in which I said that expected credit losses for US financial institutions could range in a $1 trillion to $2 trillion range. At that time, people thought that that number was exaggerated because people had in mind about the $200 to $300 billion of losses coming from subprime mortgages. So they thought 1 to 2 trillion is just way too big. But as I argued, the problem was not just one of subprime mortgages, but there were excesses of excessive credit creation, borrowing, and leverage across the financial system, the household sector, and also parts of the corporate sector. So I argued that once we'll enter in a severe recession, the losses will spread from subprime to near prime to prime mortgages, to commercial real estate, to leverage loans that finance LBOs that should have never occurred, to consumer credit, things like credit cards, auto loans, student loans, to industrial and commercial loans, to corporate bonds, to muni bonds, and then also to all the securitized instruments that securitize these underlying loans, all these CDOs, CMOs, CLOs, and the entire alphabet soup of credit derivatives. And guess what? In a matter of months, the IMF came with an estimate of almost $1 trillion of expected losses. Then they changed it to 1.4, and the latest estimate is $2.2 trillion. And other private institutions like Goldman Sachs are also estimating expected credit losses of 2.2 trillion approximately. And if you think that 2.2 trillion is a big number, unfortunately, that's kind of like a floor at this point. In some recent work I've done updating my own estimates of these credit losses, research I've done with my colleagues in my economic consultancy, RG Monitor, we now find out that actually at the peak, expected credit losses for US originated loans and securities could be as high as 3.6 trillion. And out of these 3.6 trillion, about 1.8 will be US banks and broker-dealers, the rest of it being pension funds, hedge funds, and also foreign investors, because a good 50% of the securities were sold to Europe and other parts of the world. So the toxic junk was in part sold to the rest of the world, to non-resident institutions. And if you think about the 1.8 trillion for the banks, last fall, the US banks had a capital of only 1.4. So if you even include the recapitalization as occurred of banks by the government and private sector, the banks are essentially close to zero or underwater. So in the aggregate, the US banking system is insolvent. Doesn't mean that every institution is insolvent, but some even of the largest ones are essentially having more debt liabilities than assets, and they don't have any capital at the peak. And you need another $1.4 trillion from zero to bring back the capital of these institutions to what it was before this crisis started. So this is an ugly and nasty systemic banking crisis, and the same thing is happening right now in the United Kingdom, and many banks, even in continental Europe, have severe problems. Again, not every institution is insolvent, but this is a huge crisis, and it's going to take a huge amount of time and work to clean it up. That also means that the current types of solutions, trying to provide liquidity and capital to some of these institutions, is not going to work, because if you have insolvent institutions, you have effectively to shut them down and clean them up. People in the US now are starting to talk about nationalization of banks that are insolvent. In my view, that approach is going to be a better approach than keeping alive zombie banks, because either you do what Sweden did, meaning take over insolvent banks, clean them up, separate good and bad assets, and then sell them back to the private sector, or otherwise you might end up like Japan, that kept zombie banks alive for a decade, and the credit crunch and the depression and the stagnation and deflation lasted for a decade. So paradoxically, a temporary nationalization of insolvent banks might be a more market-friendly solution than the current approach of trying to keep alive zombie banks that cannot be worked out otherwise. The current workout approach would work for illiquid banks. Many of the banks are insolvent. And I think in the next few months after the stress test, effectively we're going to be at the point in which the government is going to take over a good chunk of the banking system. As it is right now, the US government has already committed about $9 trillion of financial resources to the financial system, things between guarantees, liquidity support, investments, and recapitalization. And out of the 9 trillion, 2 has already been dispersed. So effectively, the government is already de facto controlling a good part of the financial system. The question is whether there should be also a de jure control of it or not. And my answer is yes. It's better to take over the banks, clean them up, and then sell them back than keep them alive the way it is. So this gives you a sense that actually things are awful, and the fact that the stock market in the United States has fallen another 20% after the late bear market rally of last year is a signal that many of these institutions, people realize right now, are really insolvent. And there is this vicious circle between the financial shocks and the real economy contracting, and financial shocks leading to more contraction, and more economic contraction leading to greater expected losses. So this is the situation we're facing right now. That leads me to the second point, the state of the real economy, because initially the housing bust led to a liquidity and credit crunch that tipped the economy into a recession, but now the economic recession makes these losses for financial institutions even bigger. How severe is the US recession? I would argue this is the worst recession we've had in the last 60 years, and certainly the financial crisis in the US and globally is the worst financial crisis we've had since the Great Depression. You know, a year ago, the debate in the United States about the recession was among those people in the consensus, the more optimistic, that thought that this recession was going to be short and shallow, V-shaped, contraction and then rapid recovery like the previous two. They expected the recession would last only 8 months, like the 1990-91 recession and the 2001 recession. It was short and shallow. Other people like myself argued that the excesses of leverage of the household sector, the financial system, the imbalances will lead to a much more severe U-shaped recession, more long, more deep, and more protracted, lasting at least 24 months. Guess what? Recession technically started in the US in December of 2007, so we're already in the 15th month of this recession. It's not anymore a V. We're already in the middle of the U. We're almost a year and a half into a recession. And in my view, the falling output is going to continue at least through the end of this year. The optimists, again, now argue there's going to be a recovery of growth positive in the second half of the year. The data don't really support that view. Recessions could continue at least into the end of this year for a 24-month recession. And in my view, the imbalances and the problem in the financial system, household sector, and the corporate sector are so severe that even next year, even if we had positive growth, it's going to be so low, 1% or below, that effectively will be in a recession even next year. Job losses are going to continue all the way through the end of next year, even if economic growth is going to become positive, and therefore the recession might last 36 months into the end of 2010. Usually job losses continue about a year after recession is technically over in terms of growth of GDP. So we're going to be, in the best of scenarios, in a U-shaped recession, and maybe if we do everything right, by 2011, there'll be a much more robust return of growth, still below potential of 3%, but something better than 1% or close to zero. So this is really ugly and severe, and every component of our aggregate demand is falling. And I would even argue that unless we do the right policy responses, this U-shaped recession could end up into something worse, something like more like an L-shaped recession or stagnation, like the one that Japan experienced after the bursting of its real estate and equity bubble in the 90s, essentially a near depression with a decade of lost growth and deflation. That's a serious risk. We should not rule out that actually, the V is out of the window. It's not anymore even an option. We are in the middle of a nasty and protracted U-shaped recession, and that may turn out into something like a multi-year stagnation unless we do the right types of policy changes, and I'm going to get to those in a few minutes. That leads me to the next point I want to make, that is what's happening to the rest of the world. If you think about it, until the middle of last year, the US was the only major economy in the world that was in economic contraction. Because until the middle of last year, growth in Europe, in Japan, and other advanced economies was actually okay, slowing down, but okay. And certainly growth in emerging market economy was very robust. At that time, as you remember, people were worried about overheating of these economies in emerging markets. There was high growth in India, in China, in lots of other, in Russia, in all the other major emerging markets economy in the world. So it was very high growth. That high growth was leading to a rise in oil, energy, food prices, and commodity prices, and people were worrying about inflation, about anything, not about deflation, about overheating of these economies. But guess what? By the third quarter of last year, and certainly by the fourth quarter, there was a beginning of an economic contraction in all of the advanced economies. Recession in the Eurozone, recession in the UK, a recession in the rest of Europe, recession in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Japan. Literally, almost every advanced economy in the world entered a recession by the third quarter or at the latest the fourth quarter, and this recession has been now accelerating its speed and degree of contraction. So about 2/3 of global economy, those that are advanced economies, are already in a severe recession. And in the case of emerging markets economy, you also see the beginning of a hard landing. For countries that are used to grow potentially 6-7%, if not more, a sharp contraction of growth, say if on the aggregate emerging market economy this year were to grow, say only 2%, compared to 7% last year, that will be a hard landing. You don't need zero or negative growth in emerging markets for having a recession because their potential and actual growth has been much higher. Therefore, a severe slowdown of growth is effectively a hard landing. I mean, take a country like China. China is used to grow 10% for the last decade. We forecasted, my consultant said that growth rate of China this year is going to be at best 5%, could be lower. And China needs a growth rate of about 10% to move about 8 to 10 million poor rural farmers to the modern urban industrial sector every year. So slow down from 10% to 5%, let alone even worse than that, would be a hard landing. And if you look at the numbers of China, they reported for Q4 6.8, but that's year over year. If you do the true measurement like everybody else does, it is quarter-over-quarter growth. The quarter-over-quarter growth of China was actually negative in Q4. The manufacturing sector in China, this 40% of GDP, is contracting, is already in a recession. And in the first quarter of this year, things don't look any better. So there's a massive slowdown of growth. There's actually negative growth in a number of emerging market economy. Russia was growing 8% last year, the level, if they're lucky, -4 this year. And many other emerging market economy are very sharply slowed down. An example of it is a country like your own country, where in the fourth quarter of this year, the growth has slowed down to something like slightly above 5%. Of course, there is open question how much more that contraction could be this year or whether it's going to be a recovery. So even emerging markets are facing a hard landing. The idea there will be decoupling was proven wrong, and it's not surprising. There are trade channels of transmission, there are financial channels, there are credit and liquidity channels, there are currency channels, there are commodity channels, there are confidence channels. We live in an integrated global economy where everybody is related to everybody else, trade, financial, and other integration. And when there is a major shock at the center of the system, United States, UK, and Europe, those transmission effects, first financial, all markets got highly correlated last year, equity markets, commodities, and you name it, bond markets, and eventually the transmission to trade and financial shocks entered also the real economy. So for the first time, actually, in decades, we have a global synchronized recession. It's the first time, when Japan had a recession, the rest of the world was growing fast. Sometimes you have shocks in Europe, or you have emerging market crises, but US and Europe are doing well. This time around, advanced economies, emerging markets, there is a recession. The IMF estimates a recession occurs in the global economy when global growth is less than 2.5%. Why? Less than 2.5% because the advanced economies grow on average 2%, emerging markets around 7%. So below 2.5 for the global economy, it's a recession. This year, the global economy is going to grow at a negative rate, not 2.5. It's going to grow -0.5, -1%. That's our latest estimate. So it's going to be a severe global recession. And if you look at the numbers, actually, the numbers look scary. People thought that the US will be the economy that's going to contract the most because the imbalances in the United States were the most severe. But look at the fourth quarter of last year. That are the latest number we have for the US and the global economy. The fall of output in US during that quarter, the annualized rate was -6. For the Eurozone, that was supposed to do better than the US, was also -6. But within the Eurozone, the biggest economy, Germany, had a negative growth of -8. Japan, the number was -12. In Singapore, the number was -16. In Korea, the number was -20. So if you look outside the United States, things are even uglier than they are in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America. Look at what's happening, for example, in Asia to exports. Latest numbers from places like Korea, like Taiwan, like Japan, are suggesting that exports are falling now 50%. In China, exports are falling 20%. Imports are falling 40%. And the imports of China, as you will know, are imports of raw material and intermediate inputs. So that sharp fall in imports is not good news, it's bad news. It means economic activity is slowing down in China. There's going to be less production, less exports down the line. And again, even in your own country, there has been a very sharp fall in exports that are becoming an important source of economic growth. The credit crunch has led to a liquidity crunch also for some parts of the financial system. There is a slowdown of credit. There is a slowdown of economic activity. There are many sectors that are on the verge of a recession, and you have a difficult economic condition. Still growing at an okay rate, but that rate of growth is slowing down. You know, trade, financial channels, currency and otherwise imply a massive slowdown of growth all over the world, including India, including Asia. So that's the situation we're facing right now. And it's becoming a vicious circle between the fall in aggregate demand relative to supply and what's happening to the financial shocks in the financial system. If you think about it, most components of aggregate demand in the advanced economies, and now in some of the emerging markets, are sharply falling. Consumption is falling, residential investment is falling, non-residential construction is falling, capital spending by the corporate sector is falling, inventories are falling, exports are falling. The only component of aggregate demand that is rising right now and should be rising is government spending, because the advanced economies need a fiscal stimulus to try to avoid an even more severe economic contraction. But that fiscal stimulus, in my view, in many countries, too little, too late, and in some countries you cannot afford the fiscal stimulus because you already start from large stocks of public debt and deficits. That's a constraint to giving a stimulus to the economy. And if you think about it, the degree of economic contraction is becoming severe because there is almost an element of self-fulfilling animal spirits that leads consumers and firms to cut spending more than it's even justified by fundamentals. And that leads to a recession being worse than otherwise. I'll give you an example. You know, I give presentation in front of boards of major US multinational corporations, you know, firms that have a AA or AAA ratings, and they tell me the following thing: there is so much uncertainty and so much risk out there that we have to worry about our own survival a year or two from now, because we don't know how bad things could be. It could become a near depression. If you have to want to survive, you have to save on cash. If you want to save on cash, you have to slash capex spending 20, 30%. These are investment grade firms. If you're not investment grade, you're slashing capex spending by 50, 60%. So you slash capex spending, you slash production, you slash employment, you slash inventories. And what is rational behavior at the level of an individual firm, you want to survive, in the aggregate makes the recession worse. Because if the consumers are worried about the future and are cutting back consumption, and if firms are worried about the future and they cut capex, production, employment, and therefore eventual income, then the contraction is even more severe than the one justified by fundamentals. So you have like in a bad equilibrium, which the collective action problem or a coordination game, which everybody's worried about the future, leads to this self-fulfilling animal spirit recession worse than the one justified by the economic and financial vulnerability that they were in the first place, leading to this economic contraction. So there is a collective action problem on the demand side. There is a free fall now of demand relative to aggregate supply. There is also a pretty nasty liquidity and credit crunch and reduction of the supply of credit that is also inducing this severe economic contraction. Even credit-worthy households and firms in the US and Europe don't have access to credit and capital, and this severe liquidity and credit crunch is going to make the demand fall and even the supply fall more severe than otherwise. Now, Part of that contraction of credit has to do with the fact that many banks are insolvent, and even if the government recapitalized them, they don't lend because they have to hold the capital on the basis of the expected future losses. So the banks that are in trouble are not lending because they're in trouble. The other problem of the credit crunch is that a lot of the financial intermediation in the US and Europe was occurring outside of the commercial banking system, was occurring among the non-bank financial institutions, things that people refer as the shadow banking system. And right now there has been in the last year the literal demise of most of the non-bank shadow financial system or shadow banking system. Hundreds of non-bank mortgage lenders have gone bust. The entire system of sieves and conduits. Most of the broker-dealers, have gone bust. I remember a year ago, I made a prediction before Bear Stearns. I said a couple of major U.S. broker-dealers are going to go bust, and in a matter of 2 years, there's not going to be any major independent broker-dealer left. I was too optimistic. It didn't take 2 years. It took 7 months for Bear Stearns to go bust, for Lehman to go bust, for Merrill to be forced to merge with Bank of America, and for Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley to be forced to be converted into bank holding companies and now be essentially regulated like banks. It took 7 months for the demise of Wall Street the way we know it, not even 2 years. This is the speed at which the contraction has occurred. So non-bank mortgage lenders, sieves and conduits, broker-dealers, now deleveraging of hedge funds, a good half of them are going to go out of business, and now there is a slow-motion refinancing crisis for the private equity that these LBOs at levels that were crazy, debt to earnings ratio of 10 to 15 as opposed to historical average of 5. So there'll be a massive refinancing crisis for private equity and LBO deals. Slow motion because peak toggles and covenant light are leading to a slowdown of this refinancing crisis, but it's going to hit them soon enough. So you have a collapse of the entire shadow banking system, and shadow banking system was a major provider of credit. Securitization that was occurring through the shadow banking system now is down to zero. Securitization of mortgages, of credit cards, of auto loans. So that's a massive liquidity squeeze and a credit crunch. And the problems of a supply of credit are even more severe for the following one. Even if you have institutions that are safe, leave aside the fact that most institutions don't have enough capital and they are risk averse and they cannot lend, but suppose there was even a banking institution that was safe, only good assets, no bad assets, enough capital. Would you want to lend money to credit-worthy households or firms in a condition like this one where everybody's pulling the credit? You don't want to do it because, again, there is a collective action problem, a coordination problem. If you're the only one who's extending credit and you have a firm that is illiquid but solvent, but this illiquid firm cannot roll over its own debt, that firm can end up into a financing crisis, insolvency, not because their balance sheet is in problem, but rather because you have a situation of illiquidity. So in a situation like this one, even a safe bank would not want to lend money because nobody else is lending money. If anything, everybody is pulling their money back. So you have this kind of collective action problem that leads to the worsening of the credit crunch. So you have this vicious circle between the credit crunch leading to economic contraction and the economic contraction leading to more bigger expected losses and more households and firms that are otherwise solvent going bankrupt, and that leads to another credit crunch, and we're in the middle of this vicious circle. So we have really a very severe economic and financial crisis. As I said, if we don't take the right policy action, this deep U-shaped recession may end up something worse, something like an L-shaped recession, like the one that Japan had, a stagnation, multi-year with deflation, like the one that was experienced by Japan in the 1990s. And by the way, when in the 1990s Japan was experiencing its near depression, the rest of the world was growing, so at least their own exports were going at a robust rate. Right now, there's a collapse of exports around the world because everybody's contracting. And my exports are your imports, and your exports are my imports. And therefore, this transmission effects from one country to another is becoming vicious because of this globalization of trade and financial flows. Now, can we avoid an L-shaped near stagnation for the global economy? We can avoid it, but avoiding it implies to have the appropriate types of monetary easing, of fiscal easing, of cleaning up the financial system, of dealing with the unsustainable debt burden of households and firms, of providing liquidity and loans to emerging markets that are now subject to a sudden stop of capital and reversal of capital flows. doing and helping poorer countries through IMF, World Bank, and other financial institutions, doing the appropriate types of forbearance. It's going to reduce the amount of the credit crunch, thinking creatively about ways to restore credit to credit-worthy households, small and medium-sized businesses, and even some of the larger ones that are subject to a credit crunch. The US has to do it, Europe, Japan, China, India, everybody, and has to do also in a coordinated way, trying to avoid beggar-than-neighbor policies on financial issues, on trade issues, and on other types of issues. It's going to take a lot of hard work, and unfortunately, I think we're falling behind the curve. Policymakers are moving in the right directions, but whatever they're doing, in my view, is too little, too late, and therefore my worry is that this severe economic contraction could end up even worse. We can avoid it becoming worse, but it requires much more massive and coherent and credible leadership to restore business, consumer, financial markets, and the public's confidence, and I fear that policymakers are falling behind the curve, and the risk is going to be even more severe and more protracted, the global economic crisis and economic contraction. We should avoid it. We should work together, because in this globalized economy, we swim or sink together. That's why it's a game in which everybody is going to lose if things get worse. That's why it's important to work together, the G7, the G20, advanced economies, together with India, China, Russia, other emerging markets, to get us out of this mess, because the future of the global economy is at stake.